During World War II, fear and wartime hysteria led the U.S. government to carry out an act that remains a dark moment in American history: the incarceration of Japanese Americans unjustly. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which allowed the forced removal of over 100 without evidence of disloyalty or due process. Families, many of them being U.S. citizens, were sent to harsh and isolated internment camps enclosed by barbed wires and armed guards. Japanese Americans lost their homes, businesses, and liberties. Japanese Americans endured overcrowded conditions and unfair treatment. Despite this injustice, many Japanese Americans were still displaying remarkable patriotism, with the 442nd Regimental Combat Team becoming one of the most decorated and recognized military units in U.S. history. Decades later, the U.S. government acknowledged this grave mistake through the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, offering a formal apology and reparations to survivors. The incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II was a violation of civil liberties driven by racial prejudice and wartime hysteria, later acknowledged as unjust through legal actions and the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. The attack on Pearl Harbor and Executive Order 9066. The surprising attack on Pearl Harbor without a declaration of war on December 7, 1941, made many Americans increasingly suspicious and worried about Japanese Americans, who were suspected of working for Japan. Pressed by such fears, on February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the U.S. military to remove those it deemed a security threat from certain areas. Although the order did not rule out a specific ethnicity or race, it was aimed at Japanese Americans. More than 120,000 Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were American-born and therefore American citizens, were forced to leave their homes, jobs, and lives, and were sent to remote internment camps far from family and friends. They were guilty solely because of their Japanese ancestry, for which there was no real evidence showing their disloyalty or threatening attitude toward the United States. Given only a short period in which to leave, the community's hostility was overwhelming. Many families lost all that they had acquired, including homes and businesses. Racial prejudice and a fearful decision caused the denial of their civil rights without trial or any kind of proof. Conditions in the internment camps. The internment camps were highly dehumanizing and thus very harsh on Japanese Americans during World War II. Homes and businesses were ripped apart, sometimes within days, transported to areas far, far away from their homes. They found themselves in remote, desolate places, lodged in overcrowded, poorly constructed camps, surrounded by barbed wire with armed guards patrolling the perimeters, instilling a constant sense of fear and imprisonment. Most of the camps were in desolate desert areas, making the surroundings highly inhospitable and harsh, with extreme temperatures, at times over 100 degrees Fahrenheit during summer and below freezing during winter. Living conditions within the camps were basic and uncomfortable. The barracks were no more than small, wood-frame constructions bereft of any privacy. Every family was compelled to share small rooms with little or no room for personal belongings. The walls were thin, and the rooms were frequently inadequately insulated. Hence, heat during summer and chill during winter were impossible to bear. The bathrooms were shared, and all cubicles did not have partitions, resulting in extreme loss of dignity and privacy. Common, tasteless, unappealing, and genuinely very poorly prepared meals were served in these camps. There were times when food was seldom well balanced due to the absence of fresh materials. Such types of inferior food resulted in nutritional deficiencies among the internees and exposed them to various kinds of illnesses, especially for the two most concerned groups of population, the children and elders. Outbreaks of diseases became unavoidable, considering the factor of overcrowding along with unhygienic conditions and scarcity of facilities for tending to the unwell. The educational activities within the camp were very limited, and most of the time schools were held in temporary classrooms with limited facilities and untrained teachers. Many were seriously hurt by not getting good schooling that would help them later in life. Similarly, the camps offered few chances of recreation or creative outlet. Internees were regularly cut off from contact with others and highly demoralized. They were sometimes separated from their families, being sent to different directions into various camps. However, many Japanese Americans responded to the very unkind and inhuman treatment with remarkable resilience and strength. Many joined the U.S. military, volunteering for units such as the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which would go down in history as one of the most decorated units in any war involvement. Others had more community-minded interests, banding together, helping each other, and hanging on to hope when most of the world seems to have been set against them. That would be its mark scarred, both physical and emotional scars that weren't acknowledged by the U.S. government until decades after the internment camps, are now officially recognized as having been an injustice. Legal objections to the imprisonment. Some Japanese Americans took the U.S. government to court over the decision of forced removal and detention. The most notable and most prominent cases came from Gordon Hirabayashi, Fred Korematsu, and Mitsuya Endo. These people chose to fight back against what they perceived as an unjust and unconstitutional act of the U.S. government. Hirabayashi and Korematsu challenged the violation of rights accorded to them under the U.S. Constitution. Unfortunately, they received convictions one after another in court. Still, Mitsuya Endo continued and fared better. She tried in court and proved to the court that she was a loyal citizen of the United States and thus ought not to be interned any longer forcefully in the camps. Her arguments won the case in court, and as a result, she was allowed to leave the internment camp. They contributed to a focus on bringing attention to the abuses of civil liberty during internment. Even though it contributed to providing fuel to an already growing fire over a wider debate later on in an attempt to address this egregious wrongdoing done to the Japanese Americans. The Civil Liberties Act of 1988, a step toward justice. Civil Liberties Act of 1988 was the breaking point in realizing the atrocity done to Japanese Americans during the course of World War II. After long years of battling for justice, the U.S. government finally came forward and admitting the wrong committed in the name of internment camps. Then President Ronald Reagan signed a law apologizing and offering financial compensation for the incarcerated people. Each survivor was given $20,000 to atone for their pain and loss. It was the best leap to rectify past errors by identifying the racial bias, fear, and lack of leadership that put innocents behind bars for something they never committed. This move also highlighted the protection of the civil liberties and all of its citizens, irrespective of their race and background. Wider connections. One popular internee is the actor George Takei, who talked about his childhood in the internment camps and how it has haunted him to date. Such personal stories put a face and human element on this chapter of history and point out the grave injustice that was perpetrated on Japanese Americans. Japanese American internment, as is well documented, represents part of a larger history of racial prejudice in the United States. Other minority groups are fighting and have fought the same battles. Conclusion, supposed to be Lester's part. The World War II incarceration of Japanese Americans actions violated their fundamental civil liberties and caused irreparable damage to individuals, families, and communities. And despite it all, many internees emerged from the camps with astonishing resiliency, some continuing to help in the war effort and work for justice well after the release. Decades later, the U.S. government officially apologized, acknowledging the gross injustice and offering reparations to survivors.
Japanese American internment represents a story of injustice, but at the same time testifies to be a persistent struggle for human rights and the establishment of a society that will be fair to and equal to all.